Hello and welcome to Recap Radio. I'm Diego Cupolo, Editor-in-Chief of Turkey Recap, and this is our show about Turkish politics and foreign policy. On February 11th, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan hosted Greek Prime Minister Kyriakis Mitsotakis in Ankara. The meeting went smoothly, with both leaders signing various cooperation and trade agreements, including a memorandum to launch ferry boat services between Izmir and Thessaloniki, pending EU approval. Such openings contrast with the territorial disputes that have long defined Turkey-Greek relations. Disagreements over maritime boundaries in the Aegean and Mediterranean seas have brought the NATO nations to the edge of war in the past. While in the present, these issues are creating obstacles for greater EU-Turkey defense cooperation as the bloc attempts to bolster its military capacities amid the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war. So, EU policymakers likely welcomed the positive messaging from Erdogan and Mitsotakis, who both signaled their intent to address the complex territorial disputes. To figure out what that means for Turkey-Greece relations, Turkey defense cooperation with the EU, and also the Cyprus issue, I spoke to Ioannis Grigoriadis, an associate professor of political science at Bilkent University and head of the Turkey program at the Hellenic Foundation of European and Foreign Policy, also known as ELIAMEP. Let's get into it. Thanks for joining us, Ioannis.
You're most welcome. Thank you for having me, Diego.
So before we get into all the details, and there are many, let's start simple and just talk about how you think Wednesday's meeting went. And was it what you expected? Did anything stick out to you?
Well, I think it was a very carefully planned meeting that went well. Expectations were not particularly high. Everybody knew that there wouldn't be a breakthrough in the outstanding disputes between Greece and Turkey. But there were some good vibes that came out of this meeting. There were 7 agreements that were signed. And there was also an attempt to develop a common position of Greece and Turkey as far as a major regional crisis is concerned, which is the Palestinian issue. We know that the two countries stand different on this conflict, but they agreed on declaring that they're against the annexation of the West Bank by Israel. And they also declared their willingness to help the peace process without committing necessarily to the Trump initiative on the Council of Peace. That was another interesting point because both countries have been invited, but now none of the countries have accepted the invitation yet. So I think that was another interesting common point between the two countries, that they don't feel particularly excited about the prospect of Trump administration intervening into the region, let alone into their bilateral relations.
And was it more or less what you expected this meeting to be?
Well, accidents may happen, so things could have gone worse. I think that it met the expectations of those commentators or experts that understand that no side is willing to take the political risk of a breakthrough in the bilateral disputes. But both sides recognize the significance of dialogue and having a conflict resolution mechanism that may prevent crisis from happening or may prevent small incidents from acquiring big proportions that are no longer manageable by the governments. I think that's very important. To add to that, given the way Turkish foreign policy has been transformed over the last years and through the presidential system and the concentration of power in the hands of the presidency, I think keeping the good relationship between the two leaders is also very important. This visit of Mitsotakis has been delayed for a number of reasons, and further delaying it could be a problem because it would show both lack of commitment and maybe some disrespect as well. So in a sense, the fact that it did happen and there were all these ministers that came to Ankara even for a day and they signed this agreement, which you may consider to be not on the crucial issues, but still they're important in a sense. Establishing a ferry link between Thessaloniki and Izmir is going to boost tourism and trade between the two countries. There is so much underutilized potential that even small changes may make a big difference. Even disconnections between the Greek ports and Turkish ports and improving connectivity or reducing the visa burden for Turkish tourists. There was also another mention of this program that was introduced 2 years ago about facilitating tourist visas for Turkish tourists visiting a number of Eastern Aegean islands. This proved to be a very big success, and the two leaders reiterated their commitment on running this project this year as well. Of course, this has to be approved by the European Commission, I have to note, because it's a Schengen responsibility. I think that the European Commission will not object to such an initiative, which is going to improve economic relations between the two countries and bring the two peoples closer.
So this meeting comes 3 years after Turkey and Greece began this kind of earthquake diplomacy after the February 6, 2023 earthquake in Turkey. Greece provided aid, and there was kind of a softening of rhetoric between the two countries after many years of very intense disputes about maritime boundaries and delineations in the Aegean and also East Med. So can you just give us a quick snapshot, if possible, of where Turkey-Greek relations stand today, and how's it compared to previous periods?
I think it's important to note what you said, that there was, with the arrival of the Mitsotakis administration in 2019, there was a deterioration of the relations, which was linked to developments in the Eastern Mediterranean, the failure of the Crans-Montana Conference on resolving the Cyprus problem, the signature of the Libya-Turkey memorandum on the maritime zones that was something perceived in Greece as a very aggressive act, and a very bad personal relationship between the two leaders. The earthquakes gave that opportunity to reverse that trend. And let's note here that this is a trend that refers to other aspects of Turkish foreign policy. Back then, Turkey had a lot of difficulties with several neighbors ever since Turkey has been trying to mend fences with lots of its neighbors. So Egypt, like Saudi Arabia, UAE. So the earthquake provided an opportunity to reset the agenda, and both sides were keen on taking that opportunity and establish a channel of communication and sort of dialogue that may not be sufficient to resolve the disputes, but as I said before, it maintains a certain degree of calm and sort of order in the bilateral relationship, which means that incidents that could potentially escalate into major conflicts can now be managed by simple communication between the defense ministries or the sort of the prime minister's offices. This is extremely important, and this is something that both leaders pledged to continue doing, in a sense, having this communication and recognizing in principle that dialogue and diplomatic means is the way forward for resolving the disputes, and they don't consider other means to resolve the disputes.
And compared to recent periods, would you say there's some potential for progress in relationships, or has it always been a bit difficult?
Well, there is now a discussion about Turkey's involvement into the SAFE program, like into the recasting of a European defense industry. And there have been some Greek concerns on that, and the Greek side raised the so-called casus belli issue, which is one of the issues that is outstanding. And this is
cause of war is casus belli.
Yes,
right?
in Latin, kind of when Greece ratified the UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea in the mid-90s, which gave Greece the right to extend its territorial waters up to 12 miles, the Turkish National Assembly declared that such a move would be a cause for war for Turkey. So this has become noted in Greece. It's sort of because the Greek view says that this is against the United Nations Charter, because it clearly threatens with the use of war and violence for a legal right of Greece. So this has been highlighted as one of the deteriorating points in Greek-Turkish relations. So when the Greek prime minister was asked about letting Turkey into the SAFE program or not, he requested a lifting of this. But I think here what is important to understand is that This is not something that the Turkish government did. It's a Turkish parliament. So the Turkish government, and that's sort of a discussion now, I understand, could make a declaration saying that we don't intend to use violence against Greece, or we don't intend to use war against Greece for the maritime zones issue, but we expect them to be resolved by diplomatic means. So this doesn't mean that Turkey would allow Greece to solve this problem unilaterally. They would expect that Greece comes in negotiation and dialogue with Turkey for resolving this issue. So this is where the diplomatic efforts are concentrating, in a sense, finding a way that both sides get what they really need. The Greek side sort of that Turkey stops threatening the use of violence against it if it exercises what is a legal right for Greece. But on the Turkish side, it's also what Turkey is trying to get out of this is that it doesn't appear that Turkey gives a blank check to Greece to do whatever it wants with its maritime zone. So they would expect this to come through a negotiation with a littoral country, which is Turkey. So this is something that is apparently discussed. And this, of course, would facilitate Turkey's entry into the SAFE program, which is something that the government of Turkey is caring about because of the fact that the Turkish defense industry has developed over the last years. So it is possibly one of the biggest or significant beneficiaries of the decision of the European Union to invest heavily on its defense.
Yeah, and just to clarify, the SAFE program is a weapons acquisition fund that the European Union is
True.
initiating just to give background for listeners. So the European Union is trying to acquire different arms from different countries, and Turkey and UK were not included in the
But
first
what is
round.
important, SAFE also has a strong pledge for the development of the European defense industry. So the idea is that the European Union is going to spend all this money, but they want to develop the defense industry capabilities of member states. Turkey and Ukraine are not member states. They're
Yes.
candidate states. So they have a relationship, but this relationship is not fulfilled. It's not complete, right? So this creates some area for negotiation. And this is why we're discussing this, because inviting Turkey or Ukraine requires the unanimity of member states.
Yeah, in Wednesday's talk, Mitsotakis and Erdogan were saying that there was potential for resolving these conflicts over casus belli, the threat of war over Aegean delimitations, maritime zones. This is the context for readers that aren't following the conversation as closely
In a sense,
as we are.
yes, and the Greek prime minister kind of tried to mention it openly during the public statement, saying that, if we really agree that our relationship has developed to the point that we can talk and we can agree to disagree, but we decide to talk, and we know that talking and dialogue is the way forward. So this casus belli is a remnant from the past, the bad past that we want to overcome. So let's state it that, this is not something that defines the relationship.
Yeah, so both leaders were signaling the potential for progress on this very sticky issue of, territorial disputes between Turkey and Greece. And at this moment when Europe is trying to bolster its own defenses as the Russia war continues in Ukraine and the Trump administration remains a bit distant from European security. I don't know how to define it exactly, but the Trump administration has caused Europe to reconsider its security situation. At that moment, then can we talk about some military risks? Because usually when people talk about Greece here in Ankara, where we are both based, people talk about Greece as a country that blocks Turkey's progress in EU relations and the ability to take part in programs like SAFE, where the Turkish defense industry could cooperate more with EU. As a result, Turkish defense industry is more seeking bilateral agreements, for example, directly with countries like Italy and Spain instead of the European bloc as a whole. Do you see uh, any potential for negotiations between Greece and Turkey that could unlock this? I guess the way to ask it would be, what is needed from the Greek side to allow Turkey more access to European markets, the Turkish defense sector?
Well, the quick answer is lifting the casus belli or producing a statement that renders the casus belli null and void. That would be the answer as far as Turkey's participation in the SAFE program is concerned. About the greater issues, we can talk about upgrading or updating the customs union agreement between Turkey and the European Union. It has been going on for decades, but definitely needs reconsidering. This is something, though, that is no longer simply an issue of Greece. It has to do with the overall state of Greek-Turkish relations. The Cyprus problem is always a concern, of course, because Turkey, as it is today, doesn't recognize a member state of the European Union. That adds further complexity to the negotiations. But of course, this has to do also with the domestic developments in Turkey. So there are a lot of concerns related to EU-Turkey relations that have nothing to do with Greek-Turkish relations, that has to do with the rule of law, with the condition of democracy in Turkey, which is something that is followed by the European Commission, and it is noted in the progress reports. So progress reports are produced yearly on Turkey's progress towards EU membership, while the issue is no longer discussed intensely and heavily as it used to be like 2 decades ago.
Yeah, and to take it from the Turkish perspective, according to the Treaty of Lausanne, the Greek islands near Turkey are not supposed to be militarized, and many times politicians in Ankara will say Greece is violating that treaty, and at the same time, we have recent news that Greece is acquiring Israeli defense missiles. How do you see the situation here in Turkey? Because I could see it as a very hard policy to sell Turkish citizens that we're going to remove this cause for war, while you have militarization of Aegean islands that you can see from the Turkish shore, and you also have Israeli technology being sold to Greece for defense purposes. How do you see it from the Turkish perspective?
Well, to answer your original point, it's not just the Treaty of Lausanne that Turkey is referring to. The Treaty of Lausanne only mentions some islands of Greece together with the Straits. So demilitarizing Limnos Samothraki was part of demilitarizing the Straits and Ivros and Tenedos. And this regime was lifted by the Montreux Treaty. So it is a complicated situation that both sides tries to look into. The problem is that there has been some significant security concern on the side of the Greek public opinion that supported this militarization of Eastern Aegean islands. So apart from the sort of legal dimension of this, there is also an Aegean army standing opposite the Greek islands, right? So in a sense, there can be made arguments about that. Of course, I understand that there is some concern among Turkish public opinion circles about the rise of Greek-Israeli cooperation, and even if we can call it strategic cooperation on certain security and defense areas. This started, and that's important to note, following the sharp deterioration of Israeli-Turkey relations in the 2010s, in the early 2010. So the relationship grew under the circumstances of the time, and has acquired some defense and security dimensions. This is true. And I think that was another purpose of the meeting of the two leaders, that the Greek prime minister kind of tried to reassure Turkey that developing Greek-Israeli relations doesn't have an anti-Turkey hue. It's not essentially an anti-Turkey move. It is a relationship that has improved over the last years because the two countries that share economic interest, and if you see the sort of the Turkey-Israeli trade and the Greek-Israeli trade, you may still be surprised to see the Turkey-Israeli trade even today may be higher under the circumstances we're talking about, right? So there's nothing malevolent by definition in the improvement of Israeli-Greek relations. Of course, this has to be framed in an Eastern Mediterranean strategy that is inclusive and doesn't lead some countries to stay outside sort of such initiatives. So there have been some trilateral initiatives between Greece, Cyprus, Israel, Greek, Cyprus, Egypt, that started at the time. Relations of Turkey with Israel and Egypt were very bad. Now relations between Turkey and Egypt have improved to a significant amount. So I could imagine that these projects could be reconsidered so that countries like Turkey or Libya or Syria, if we move to a new phase, right? If the countries are consolidated and they sort of develop interest in the region, in regional peace and cooperation, they could be added. And in any case, I don't think that Greece is responsible for the state of Israeli-Turkish relations. Israeli-Turkish relations get deteriorated for their own reasons. And if Israel and Turkey manage to mend their fences and sort of recover their relationship, that would mean that this would allow for more regional cooperation opportunities with Greece. And as I mentioned already, the fact that there was a common statement by the Greek and Turkish leaders on the Palestinian issue shows that there is some sort of potential for cooperation in a very sensitive conflict that, of course, involves Israel first and foremost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. For people that are just trying to understand, will Turkey and Greece go to war anytime soon? What do you tell them? Is there a risk of conflict or some kind of tension outbreak? Because from what I understand, the jets are flying over the Aegean for both countries, and sometimes they engage in dogfights. Sometimes there's weapons on the plane. Sometimes there's not. Can you just give a simple, what's
risk is very, very low, and it's much lower following the meeting. You mentioned the dogfights and the jet overflights. One of the most interesting effects of the earthquake diplomacy of the recent years has been the very sharp decrease in the number of dogfights. They haven't disappeared, but there's a very sharp decline of them, which is a positive sign. Because, of course, these dogfights generate the risk of an accident that it would be very difficult to manage for both sides. So in that respect, I would say that the fact that the leaders meet and the ministers meet and there is this dialogue and communication channels that are developed means that the risk of an accident or a risk of an armed conflict is very, very low.
Oh, good. It sounds good to me. We could use less risk of conflict in our region here. What do you make of the Cyprus issue, which we've talked lightly about, but I really want to know if you have any thoughts about the potential for renewed talks with the new North Cypriot presidency showing openness to discussions?
Well, definitely the election of Tufan Erkürman was a very positive sign on the side of a Turkish Cypriot community, that it really doesn't consider partition or attachment to Turkey as the solution to the Cyprus problem. So they're willing to talk in light of the UN framework for resolving the Cyprus problem. But given the past experience, I understand that both the United Nations and the international community require some strong commitment on all parties for the restart of a peace talks, because they don't want to have yet another failure. And I understand that this failure would be sort of catastrophic for the conflict resolution prospects. So they want to create conditions so that this process starts and goes swiftly and reaches results. Let's not forget that there is a very big convergence acquis, like there is some accumulated agreements over the decades that the two sides can use as a starting point for the final negotiation process. There has been a recent visit by the personal envoy of the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. Mariangela Olgin visited Cyprus, and there was a hope about the announcement of some confidence building measures that would precipitate and facilitate the start of peace talks. Unfortunately, there was no breakthrough yet, but we may see it happening in the coming weeks or months. So I'm not pessimistic about that, but I have to note that the international community wants to make sure that if there is an initiative, this is going to produce results and it's going to change the status quo on the island, which is understood to be unacceptable according to international law, but also politically very toxic and dangerous, because I think it's very hard to overstate the significance of the negative effect of the Cyprus problem on Greek-Turkish relations.
Mm-hmm. And is there, looking ahead, where dynamics are heading in Greek-Turkish relations, is there anything you're looking out for?
Safe would be an interesting indicator. Whether this obstacle is going to be overcome is quite important. And another important indicator would be the ability of Greece and Turkey to develop some common diplomatic understanding or initiatives even in regional conflicts which are not directly involving them. So in a sense, developing some common initiatives in Palestine or in Ukraine, kind of coming up with a voice that adds credibility and legitimacy to their statement about pledging on dialogue and cooperation. All this would be very important and interesting. And of course, what is always welcome is improving dialogue and civil society cooperation between the two sides, where the potential remains unfulfilled, and there are a lot of fruits to be collected with relatively small investment and effort.
Great. Well, thanks again for doing this.
You're most welcome, Diego.
To wrap, that was Ioannis Grigoriadis, Associate Professor of Political Science at Bilkent University and Head of the Turkey Program at the Hellenic Foundation of European and Foreign Policy, also known as ELIAMEP. This podcast is a production of Turkey Recap, a newsletter on Turkish politics, foreign policy, and business. If you like what you heard, visit turkeyrecap.com for more coverage. Turkish language readers can also follow our political coverage at studiorecap.com. We invite your feedback, send us suggestions or questions to info@turkeyrecap.com. Stay safe, stay well, and see you next time.